What if everything you've been told about ancient myths was wrong? What if some of history's greatest legends turned out to be true? Number 8. Vinland. The frozen coast the sagas swore was real. You've probably heard someone dismiss this one in a single sentence. Vikings discovering America 5 centuries before Columbus? Sure, and next you'll tell me, dragons guarded their ships. For nearly 1,000 years, 2 Icelandic sagas, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, told a story that read less like poetry and more like a captain's log. They described a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson sailing west from Greenland around the year 1000 CE and stumbling onto a new coastline. Not a barren one either. The sagas described wild grapes growing in such abundance that the crew named the place Vinland, Wineland. They described self-sown wheat, tall timber, salmon so big the crew had never seen anything like them, and a native population the Norse called Skraelings, who fought back hard enough to send the settlers home for good. Historians filed it away exactly where you'd expect. A saga is not a source. These were oral tales recorded 2 centuries after the events they describe, written down by Christian scribes with every incentive to embellish a founding legend for their own people. Grapevines in Newfoundland sounded like wishful storytelling dressed up as memory. Even scholars who accepted that the Norse had reached Greenland treated any voyage further west as unproven folklore, the medieval equivalent of a fisherman's tale that grew a little each winter. Except in 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife, Anne Stein Ingstad, went looking anyway. They didn't dig randomly. They sailed the coastline of Newfoundland, reading the sagas like a map, matching descriptions of currents, headlands, and travel times against the actual geography. A local fisherman in a small village called Lance Oz Meadows led them to a set of low grassy mounds he'd always assumed were old indigenous structures. Ingstad wasn't so sure. Excavations that began the following year uncovered the unmistakable outline of Norse turf-walled buildings, 8 of them laid out in a pattern that matched contemporary Norse settlements back in Greenland and Iceland almost exactly. Diggers found a bronze cloak pin of a style worn only by Norsemen. They found a stone oil lamp, a whetstone for sharpening iron tools the local indigenous population didn't manufacture, and most conclusively, iron slag and a small smithy. Physical proof that someone at this site had been smelting and working iron centuries before any other confirmed European presence in the Americas. Radiocarbon dating placed the site right around 1000 CE, the exact window the sagas described. In 2021, a tree ring analysis of preserved wood at the site, cross-referenced against a known spike in radiocarbon from a solar storm in the year 993, allowed researchers to date 3 cut logs to the precise year 1021 CE, with what amounted to forensic certainty. Not roughly 1,000 years ago, the year 1021, on the nose, later excavation seasons through the 1970s, expanded and formalized under Parks Canada, only reinforced the picture. Researchers found a small bronze ring-headed pin, iron boat rivets consistent with Norse shipbuilding, and a spindle whorl used for spinning wool. Evidence not just of a raiding party passing through, but of a mixed group, men and women, staying long enough to make repairs, process resources, and settle in for at least one winter. Carbon dating on multiple hearths and wood samples across the site converged tightly on the same narrow window, ruling out the possibility that later, unrelated visitors had simply left similar debris centuries apart. Lance Ox Meadows wasn't Vinland itself. Most researchers now agree. It looks more like a way station, a base camp the Norse used to process timber and resources before pushing further south into warmer country, exactly where the wild grapes the sagas described would have actually grown. But the argument was over. The sagas hadn't invented a fantasy voyage to flatter Norse pride. They had preserved the memory of a real transatlantic crossing, told and retold around fires for 200 years before anyone thought to write it down, and accurate enough that archaeologists eventually followed its directions straight to the site. But while the Norse quietly slipped in and out of a continent nobody believed they'd reached, our next legend involves a king whose name became a byword for greed, and a touch that scholars insisted was pure fable until his tomb stopped them cold. Number 7. King Midas, the golden touch that was never really about gold. Everyone knows the punchline before they know the man. Touch something, turn it to gold, starve to death surrounded by riches. It sounds like exactly the kind of moral fairy tale the Greeks loved inventing to warn children about greed, and for most of modern history, that's precisely what classicists assumed it was. The myth, first told in fragments, and later immortalized by the Roman poet Ovid, describes a Phrygian king named Midas who is granted a wish by the god Dionysus and foolishly asks that everything he touches turn to gold. Ovid's version is unmistakably literary, dripping with irony and built for moral instruction, not historical record. For centuries, King Midas existed in the same imaginative category as centaurs and satyrs, a colorful character invented to dramatize a lesson about wanting too much. There was just one persistent, irritating detail nobody could quite explain away. Ancient Greek historians, including Herodotus, wrote about Midas not as a mythical figure, but as a genuine king who had ruled a real kingdom called Phrygia in what is now central Turkey, and who had supposedly sent lavish gifts to the oracle at Delphi. Assyrian royal records from the exact same era independently referenced a Western Anatolian ruler they called Mita, a name philologists immediately recognized as the same figure. A fable doesn't usually show up in two unrelated empires' administrative paperwork. Then archaeologists started digging at the site of Gordion, the ancient Phrygian capital, southwest of modern Ankara. Dominating the site was an enormous earthen burial mound, over 50 meters tall, that local tradition had been calling the Tomb of Midas for as long as anyone could remember. In 1957, a team from the University of Pennsylvania, led by archaeologist Rodney Young, finally tunneled into it. What they found inside stunned the field: a wooden burial chamber, perfectly preserved by the dry Anatolian clay for nearly 3,000 years, containing the remains of an elderly man surrounded by more than 150 bronze vessels, elaborate furniture, and the largest and best preserved assemblage of Iron Age wooden furniture ever recovered anywhere on Earth. Radiocarbon and dendrochronological dating placed the burial squarely in the late 8th century BCE, precisely the era the historical Mita of Phrygia would have died. Dock-style analysis on fragments preserved inside the tomb revealed extraordinarily fine dyed wool and intricate weaving techniques. Evidence of an economy wealthy enough to support specialized craftsmen dedicated to nothing but luxury textile production. Exactly the kind of surplus wealth a legend about turning ordinary objects into treasure tends to grow out of. And then there was the gold itself, or rather, the reason everyone assumed there would be gold in the first place. Phrygia sat beside the Pactolus River, a waterway later Greek writers described as carrying literal grains of gold down from the mountains, so much of it that the neighboring kingdom of Lydia would go on to mint the world's first gold and silver coins using that exact river's alluvial deposits. A kingdom sitting on a river that genuinely ran with gold dust would have looked, to outsiders trading with it for the first time, like a ruler whose touch turned ordinary things into treasure. The myth wasn't inventing a moral lesson from nothing. It was exaggerating the very real, very specific economic miracle of a Phrygian king who controlled one of the ancient world's richest sources of natural gold, folded into a story simple enough for a child to repeat and specific enough that historians on 2 continents kept independently writing his name down. But if a king's greed could leave behind an actual tomb, our next legend asks what happens when an entire monster turns out to be standing exactly where the myth insisted, wearing a very different face than anyone expected. Number 6. The Minotaur's Labyrinth, the maze that turned out to be a palace. Half man, half bull, locked inside an unsolvable maze, devouring youth sent as tribute, until a hero finally cut him down. If any ancient monster sounds purely, safely fictional, it's this one. The Greek myth describes King Minos of Crete commissioning the brilliant inventor Daedalus to build an elaborate, inescapable labyrinth beneath his palace at Knossos to imprison the Minotaur, a creature born from an unnatural union between the queen and a sacred bull. Every 9 years, Athens was forced to send 14 young men and women into the labyrinth as tribute, never to return, until the hero Theseus volunteered, unwound a ball of thread through the maze, and killed the beast at its center. For most of the modern era, this was treated as pure fantasy, a story about a maze so architecturally impossible it could only exist in imagination, attached to a hybrid creature that obviously never lived. That confidence started cracking in 1900 when British archaeologist Arthur Evans began excavating a massive mound on Crete near the village of Knossos. What emerged from the ground wasn't a maze built to imprison a monster. It was something almost stranger, a real palace complex of such staggering size and complexity that a person walking through it without guidance genuinely could get lost. Over 300 interconnected rooms, corridors twisting at odd angles, staircases leading nowhere obvious, storage magazines running for hundreds of feet, all built and rebuilt across centuries into a structure so labyrinthine that later Greeks visiting its ruins may have simply started calling it exactly what it looked like. Evans uncovered something else that made the bull connection impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Frescoes covering the palace walls depicted a ritual sport called bull leaping, young athletes vaulting directly over the horns of charging bulls in a display so central to Minoan culture that images of bulls appear on nearly every surface archaeologists excavated, carved into stone, painted on pottery, cast in bronze figurines of leaping acrobats frozen mid-vault. Excavators also found a network of double-headed axes, called labries, carved into walls throughout the palace repeatedly, a symbol so pervasive that many linguists now believe the word labyrinth itself derives directly from labries, meaning, quite literally, the house of the double axe. Clay tablets written in a script called Linear B, eventually deciphered in the 1950s by architect and amateur linguist Michael Ventris, confirmed the palace had been the administrative heart of a genuine Bronze Age civilization, the Minoans, a sophisticated maritime power that dominated the Aegean centuries before classical Greece existed, complete with taxation records, trade inventories, and religious offerings. None of it mythology, all of it bureaucracy. The tablets even recorded livestock counts and ration goods with the dry precision of a warehouse ledger, the last thing anyone would expect to find buried beneath a monster's lair. Excavators also uncovered evidence that the palace had ultimately been destroyed by a massive fire sometime in the late Bronze Age, its upper floors collapsing inward and burying the ground level in ash and rubble. A destruction event so total that later generations, wandering its ruined, half-buried corridors, would have had every reason to imagine something monstrous had once been sealed away beneath the wreckage. No skeleton of a half-bull creature was ever going to turn up, and nobody seriously expects one to. But the myth wasn't built from nothing. It preserved the genuine memory of a real, immense, genuinely disorienting palace on Crete, a real and deeply important bull cult at the center of Minoan religious life, and quite possibly a real distant folk memory of a young tribute-paying relationship between Bronze Age Athens and a dominant Cretan power, all of it compressed by later Greeks into a single unforgettable monster and a maze built to hold him. But if a labyrinth could hide inside an actual palace this whole time, our next legend asks what happens when an entire city, one ancient historians wrote about by name, turns out to be sitting underwater exactly where they said it sank. Number 5, Heracleion, the Egyptian port city that outlived its own name. Some lost cities exist only in legend. This one existed in tax records, in temple inscriptions, in the writings of Herodotus himself, and modern archaeologists still spent over 2,000 years insisting it was probably somewhere on dry land, if it had ever existed at all. Ancient Egyptian and Greek sources described a wealthy port city called Thonis by the Egyptians and Heracleion by the Greeks, sitting at the mouth of the Nile, where it emptied into the Mediterranean. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, claimed to have visited it himself and described a magnificent temple dedicated to Heracles. Other inscriptions described it as Egypt's great gateway for international trade, the customs checkpoint through which Greek merchants had to pass before entering Egypt proper, collecting tariffs on behalf of the pharaoh. For a city this thoroughly documented, its exact location had somehow been completely lost. By the time of the Roman era, the name had simply stopped appearing in records, and no ruins matching its description had ever been located on the Egyptian coastline. Mainstream Egyptology's working theory was straightforward. Thonis and Heracleion were probably two separate cities, or possibly the same city under two names, that had simply been abandoned, buried, or built over somewhere along the modern shoreline near Alexandria, its ruins likely destroyed or absorbed by later construction the way so many ancient sites eventually are. Nobody was hunting for it underwater, because nobody had a strong reason to assume it was underwater at all. In 2000, French underwater archaeologist Franck Gaudio and his team, using sonar and magnetometer surveys of Abu Qir Bay, roughly 4 miles off Egypt's modern coast, picked up readings that shouldn't have been there. What they found beneath 30 feet of Mediterranean water and centuries of silt stopped the diving team cold. An entire submerged city, remarkably intact, spread across the seabed. Massive fallen statues of pharaohs, over 16 feet tall. The colossal remains of a temple dedicated to the god Amun-Gareb, matching Herodotus' description almost exactly. More than 700 ancient anchors and 64 shipwrecks scattered across what had clearly once been a functioning harbor. Evidence of centuries of continuous maritime trade. Most decisively, divers recovered a black granite stele, a formal inscribed slab commissioned by the pharaoh Nectanebo I, still bearing the name Thonis, carved directly into its surface, sitting a few hundred meters from a separate inscription referring to the same location as Heracleion. The two names historians had spent generations arguing might belong to different cities turned out to belong to exactly one place, and that place had been sitting underwater the entire time, hiding in plain sight a few miles offshore from one of the most heavily studied stretches of coastline in the ancient world. Gaudio's team went on to recover more than 70 ancient ships, a haul so large it reshaped scholars' understanding of late-period Egyptian shipbuilding, along with gold jewelry, ritual bronze vessels, and dozens of limestone sarcophagi believed to have once held mummified animals offered to the temple. Divers also found everyday objects scattered across the harbor floor: cooking pots, oil lamps, coins spanning several centuries, the unglamorous debris of a working port city going about its business right up until the moment it began slipping under the waterline. Geological surveys later explained why nobody had thought to look there. The soft Nile Delta sediment the city had been built on gradually liquefied and subsided under the weight of its own temples and harbor structures, worsened by rising sea levels and possibly a localized earthquake, sinking the entire city gradually beneath the waves over the course of several centuries, rather than in one dramatic night. The ancient writers hadn't been describing a myth. They had been describing their own contemporary, functioning port city, one that modern scholars simply assumed had vanished from the historical record instead of vanishing beneath the water a few miles from shore. But if a fully functioning Egyptian port could hide from archaeologists for 2,000 years, our next legend asks what happens when the monster itself turns out to be sitting in a museum drawer the whole time, mistaken for something else entirely. Number 4, the Cyclops, the one-eyed giant that was actually an elephant. This is the strangest entry on this list, because nobody involved in creating the myth was lying, and nobody involved in solving it needed a single archaeological dig. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus and his crew are trapped in the cave of Polyphemus, a monstrous, one-eyed giant, a Cyclops, who devours several of the sailors before Odysseus blinds his single enormous eye and escapes. For most of literary history, the Cyclops was treated as pure poetic invention, a giant built from nothing but imagination and metaphor, representing the terrifying scale of unknown dangers a sailor might encounter on unfamiliar shores. There was no obvious physical inspiration to point to. Nobody expected there to be one, except the ancient Greeks who told and retold this myth were living on and around Mediterranean islands, particularly Sicily and Crete, that happened to be scattered with the fossilized skulls of an extinct species called Elephas falconeri, a dwarf elephant that once roamed those islands and stood barely 3 feet tall at the shoulder. And elephant skulls, unlike the skulls of almost any other large mammal, have one deeply strange feature. The trunk's nasal cavity sits as a single large hole directly in the center of the skull's face, far larger and more prominent than the small eye sockets on either side. To a farmer in ancient Sicily plowing a field or digging a well and unearthing one of these skulls with no concept of elephants, having never seen one alive, the skull wouldn't look like an elephant at all. It would look instantly and unmistakably like the skull of an enormous, terrifying, one-eyed humanoid creature, roughly the right size to have been imagined as a giant, staring back out of the ground with a single massive socket where an eye should be. This isn't speculation dressed up as certainty, Paleontologists have been documenting the physical resemblance and its plausible connection to Cyclops mythology since the 19th century, and it remains one of the most widely cited examples of how ancient peoples, encountering genuine fossil evidence with no scientific framework to interpret it, built coherent mythology to explain physical remains they could see, touch, and measure with their own hands, but had no way to properly identify. Othenio Abel, the Austrian paleontologist who first published the theory formally in 1914, pointed out that dwarf elephant fossils are unusually concentrated in exactly the same regions where Cyclops legends were most deeply rooted in Greek and Sicilian folklore, a geographic overlap too precise to easily dismiss as coincidence. Modern comparisons make the resemblance almost impossible to unsee. Lay a dwarf elephant skull next to an artist's reconstruction of a Cyclops face, and the single central cavity lines up almost perfectly with where a giant, socket-set eye would sit, while the real eye sockets, small and set low on either side, simply vanish from a casual glance the way they would for any farmer with a shovel and no formal training in comparative anatomy. Sicily's fossil beds are also unusually dense and unusually shallow, meaning encounters with these skulls wouldn't have been rare curiosities. They would have been a recurring, generation-spanning experience for anyone working the island's soil. The Cyclops was never a monster invented from nothing. It was a genuine fossil, misread by people doing exactly what any curious person does when they find something they can't explain, building the most reasonable story their available knowledge allowed. But if a giant skull could survive underground for hundreds of thousands of years waiting to be misunderstood, our next legend asks what happens when an entire lost city, dismissed for 1,000 years as pure desert fantasy, turns out to be sitting exactly where satellites finally pointed. Number 3, Ubar, the Atlantis of the sands. Every culture seems to need one impossible, glittering city that vanished. In the Arabian Peninsula, that city had a name centuries before Europe ever heard of Atlantis, and it came with something most lost city legends never bother including, a very specific reason for its own destruction. Arab folklore and the Quran itself describe a magnificent city called Iram of the Pillars, also known in later legend as Ubar, a wealthy trading hub built by the tribe of Ad deep in the Arabian desert, famous for towering pillared architecture and staggering wealth built on the frankincense trade. According to the traditional account, the city's people grew arrogant and corrupt, and God buried the entire metropolis beneath the sands as punishment, erasing it so completely that later generations weren't even certain it had ever occupied a fixed location at all. For most of the 20th century, Western archaeologists treated Ubar the way they treated most desert legends layered in religious language as almost certainly allegorical, a moral parable about pride rather than a description of an actual city with actual coordinates. The Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, one of the most punishing remote desert environments on Earth, made any serious ground search practically impossible anyway. Even researchers who suspected a real trading settlement might be the seed of the legend generally assumed its remains, if they existed, had been permanently scoured away by centuries of shifting dunes. In the late 1980s, a documentary filmmaker and amateur archaeologist named Nicholas Clapp became fixated on the legend and partnered with attorney and fellow enthusiast George Hedges to pursue something nobody had seriously tried, using space-based technology to search for it. Clapp obtained radar imagery collected by NASA's space shuttle missions, a technology originally built to map subsurface geology, and passed it to researchers at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. The imaging radar could see straight through the surface sand, revealing ancient trade routes and dried riverbeds completely invisible to the naked eye and to conventional aerial photography. Cross-referencing those buried caravan routes on the satellite data, the tracks converged from multiple directions onto a single point in the Dhofar region of Oman, a place local Bedouin had long called Shisr, and had never stopped visiting for water, even though nobody living remembered any city having stood there. In 1992, an excavation team led by archaeologist Juris Zarins began digging and unearthed the walls and towers of a genuinely fortified octagonal settlement built around a large natural water source and dated to roughly the height of the ancient frankincense trade sometime between the 8th century BCE and the 4th century CE. And then geologists explained the ending in a way that made the ancient legend's core claim almost eerily literal. The fortress had been built directly above a massive limestone cavern, hollowed out over centuries by the very water source that had made the settlement so valuable in the first place. At some point, the cavern's roof gave way, and a significant portion of the city, including some of its towers, collapsed and was swallowed directly into the ground beneath it, exactly as the old story insisted, sinking into the sands rather than being buried by them. Pottery recovered from the site included fragments imported from as far away as Syria, Greece, and Rome, confirming Ubar had genuinely sat at the crossroads of a vast, long-distance incense trade network stretching across the ancient world. Exactly the kind of city wealthy enough to inspire centuries of jealous legend about its own destruction. The legend of Ubar wasn't describing divine punishment raining from the sky. It was describing an actual sinkhole event at an actual desert trading city, remembered for over 1,000 years with enough geographic precision that satellite radar orbiting the Earth eventually found its way straight back to the spot. But if a lost city could hide beneath moving sand for over a millennium, our next legend asks what happens when an ancient king's mines, dismissed as pure Sunday school embellishment, turn out to be one of the largest industrial operations of the entire ancient world. Number 2, King Solomon's mines, the treasure that turned out to be copper, not gold. The legend promised gold. What archaeologists actually found underground was something almost more impressive, and it took modern science to prove it belonged to the right king at all. Biblical and later literary tradition describes King Solomon of Israel as staggeringly wealthy, his kingdom fueled by vast mining operations producing gold, silver, and precious metal on a scale that later storytellers, most famously the 19th century novelist H. Rider Haggard, turned into full-blown treasure-hunting fantasy. For generations, biblical scholars treated any specific claim about Solomon's mines with heavy skepticism. The 10th century BCE, when Solomon supposedly reigned, fell into a stretch of the archaeological record so thin on confirmed material evidence that an entire school of biblical minimalist scholars argued the United Kingdom of Israel under Solomon may have been a much smaller, far less impressive polity than the text describes, if it existed as a unified state at all. The prime physical candidate for the location of any real mining operation had actually been known for decades. A copper-rich site called Timna Valley in Israel's southern Negev desert, close to the Red Sea. But for most of the 20th century, the leading archaeological consensus, championed by influential Israeli archaeologist Benno Rothenberg, dated the major mining activity at Timna to the Egyptian New Kingdom period, centuries before Solomon could possibly have reigned, run by Egyptian overseers rather than any Israelite kingdom. Case closed, most assumed. Solomon's mines were either a different, unlocated site or pure legend. That consensus began collapsing in the 2000s, when a team led by archaeologist Erez Ben Yosef of Tel Aviv University returned to Timna with a technique the earlier excavators simply hadn't had access to: high-precision radiocarbon dating applied directly to preserved organic material, something copper slag heaps happen to preserve unusually well, because the intense heat of ancient smelting carbonizes nearby organic debris and seals it in place. Digging into a massive smelting site, nicknamed Slaves' Hill, the team recovered thousands of pieces of preserved date pits, seeds, and cloth fragments, and radiocarbon dated them with a precision earlier excavators could only have dreamed of. The results overturned decades of assumption. The most intensive layer of industrial-scale copper production at Timna dated squarely to the 10th century BCE, precisely Solomon's traditional reign, and crucially, showed no Egyptian material culture present at all. No Egyptian pottery. No Egyptian religious artifacts. Nothing suggesting Egyptian administrators had run the operation during this specific phase. Instead, researchers found evidence of a highly organized, hierarchical society capable of directing and provisioning a genuinely massive industrial workforce, including remarkably well-preserved textile fragments dyed with a rare and expensive purple-blue pigment called royal blue, a color associated in later biblical text directly with priestly and royal garments, found nowhere else in the region from this period in this quantity. Further studies of the smelting furnaces themselves revealed a rapid, sophisticated leap in metallurgical technology occurring in this exact window, consistent with a centralized authority, investing heavily in expanding and modernizing production almost overnight. Nobody is claiming archaeologists have found a signed receipt from Solomon himself. Ben Yosef's team also identified evidence of a fortified administrative structure at the summit of Slaves' Hill, overseeing the smelting operation below, along with imported food remains, fish bones from the Mediterranean coast, pistachios, and grapes, proving whoever ran the site had the logistical reach to supply workers in the middle of a desert with provisions hauled in from hundreds of miles away. But the mines were real. The operation was staggeringly larger and more organized than anyone expected for the region and era. It ran on a scale requiring genuine centralized political power, and it dates to exactly the century tradition insists Solomon reigned. The treasure wasn't gold glittering in a cave. It was industrial copper, smelted by the thousands of tons in one of the harshest deserts on Earth, organized by someone with the authority to make it happen. But if a desert full of furnaces could preserve the fingerprints of a real ancient kingdom this precisely, our final legend asks what happens when a supposedly fictional king turns out to have his own city's walls still standing, described in a poem 1,000 years older than Homer. Number 1, Gilgamesh, the king everyone assumed was invented to be immortal. We saved this one for last on purpose. Every other legend on this list describes an event. This one describes a man, and for most of modern history, nobody was even sure he had existed at all. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed in ancient Mesopotamia and preserved most completely on 12 clay tablets, recovered from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, is widely considered the oldest surviving major work of literature on Earth, predating Homer by well over 1,000 years. It describes Gilgamesh as a king of the city of Uruk, 2/3 god and 1/3 man, a tyrannical ruler tamed by friendship with a wild man named Enkidu, who battles monsters, defies the gods, and ultimately fails in his desperate quest for immortality. For most of the 19th century, after the poem was rediscovered and translated, it was treated almost entirely as literature and theology, a foundational myth explaining mortality itself, with Gilgamesh assumed to be a purely legendary, composite hero rather than a real historical ruler. The epic's own descriptions didn't help its credibility as history. It describes Gilgamesh's mother as a literal goddess, describes him wrestling and befriending a man created directly by the gods out of clay, and describes a journey to a cedar forest guarded by a fire-breathing monster named Humbaba. Nothing about the text read like a royal chronicle. It read deliberately and beautifully, like myth. Except buried within the epic was one detail scholars couldn't easily wave away: a boastful, highly specific description of the massive defensive walls Gilgamesh supposedly built around the city of Uruk. Walls the poem claims stretched for miles and were constructed from fired brick to a standard of craftsmanship the text insists no other city could match. Separately, ancient Mesopotamian scribes had also preserved something called the Sumerian King List, a chronicle recording the names and reign lengths of Mesopotamia's earliest rulers. It includes Gilgamesh, listed as the 5th king of Uruk, in a section of the list where absurd, clearly mythical reign lengths of tens of thousands of years gradually give way, king by king, to numbers that suddenly become plausible for an actual human lifespan. Exactly around the point where Gilgamesh's name appears, archaeologists excavating the site of Uruk itself, in modern Iraq, beginning seriously in the early 20th century and continuing for decades afterward, under teams including the German Archaeological Institute, uncovered something the epic had specifically bragged about: a massive city wall, originally stretching roughly 6 miles in circumference, built from fired mud brick to a scale and sophistication matching the poem's boasts astonishingly closely, dated to the same broad era the Sumerian king list assigns to Gilgamesh's reign, somewhere around 2700 BCE. Uruk itself turned out to be not a legendary city, but one of the largest and most administratively advanced urban centers anywhere on Earth at that time, widely considered by archaeologists to be among the first true cities in human history, complete with early writing, organized religion, and centralized government, everything a real king would have needed to actually order 6 miles of wall built. At its height, Uruk may have housed as many as 50,000 people, a population density unheard of anywhere else on the planet at the time. Packed inside precisely the kind of towering fired brick fortifications the epic spends its opening lines boasting about before the story of Gilgamesh himself even properly begins. No credible historian believes Gilgamesh was literally two-thirds divine, or that he personally battled a fire-breathing forest guardian. But the consensus among Assyriologists today has shifted dramatically from the 19th century's confident dismissal. Most now accept that a real king named Gilgamesh almost certainly did rule Uruk sometime in the early dynastic period, that the walls the epic describes so specifically are the same walls archaeologists eventually excavated, and that centuries after his death, oral tradition transformed a genuinely powerful, genuinely wall-building Sumerian king into humanity's first great literary hero, wrapped in divinity, because that was the only language available to explain a ruler who had accomplished something that felt, to the people who remembered him, genuinely superhuman. And that is the pattern hiding underneath every single one of these stories. From a Norse settlement dated to the exact year by a solar storm buried in tree rings, to a Phrygian king's tomb packed with 3,000 years of undisturbed treasure, from a labyrinth that turned out to be an actual palace, to an Egyptian port city sitting quietly underwater a few miles from shore, from a monster's skull that was really an elephant's, to a lost desert city that satellites found from space, from an industrial copper operation smelting in the world's harshest terrain, to a king's own boasted city walls, still standing after 4,000 years. Our ancestors weren't careless storytellers inventing something out of nothing. They were witnesses working with the only tools they had, turning genuine memory into language built to outlast them. And notice something else about every single one of these discoveries. None of them were found by someone setting out to prove a legend correct. They were found by fishermen dragging nets they didn't understand, by tunnel diggers, by radar engineers reading satellite data, and by archaeologists patiently dating grains of carbonized wheat. The evidence didn't go looking for the legends. The legends were simply standing exactly where the evidence eventually arrived. That should change how you look at every ancient story you've ever been told to dismiss as pure fantasy. The myths we were taught to laugh off were never really myths at all. They were the earliest form of the historical record, encoded in the only language available at the time, waiting patiently under sand, sediment, mud, and centuries of academic doubt for someone to finally go looking.